My DL yelled and humiliated me in front of everyone at Easter brunch. That's when I knew she wasn't just being rude. She was drawing battle lines. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and tell me the city you're watching from. Margaret, you actually showed up. I was hoping you'd forget. Chelsea's voice rang out across the dining room, pitched high enough for every guest to hear. I stopped just inside the doorway, my basket of hot cross buns in one hand, a bouquet of tulips in the other. She didn't move to take them. Didn't even soften her smile. It was the kind of smile that hides a knife. Well, don't just stand there, she went on. You can start by taking coats. It was Easter Sunday. My son's house, though technically it wasn't his at all, was packed. Friends from Boston, neighbors, a few business associates. All of them paused to watch me obey. I set the basket on the sideboard, the flowers on a corner of the table no one was using. No one said hello. Daniel sat at the far end, eyes down, thumbs busy on his phone. Margaret? Juice is low. Chelsea called out like she was talking to staff. I took the pitcher and poured for each guest, my hands steady. Years of teaching school had taught me how to keep my face neutral when my insides boiled. Bread basket's empty, she added moments later. I refilled it. Then I cleared plates still holding food. The chatter in the room was polite, airy, like I wasn't there except to serve. I was halfway around the table when it happened. My elbow brushed a small dish of strawberry jam. A streak of red bloomed across the crisp white tablecloth, gasps. Small, sharp, cut through the air. Chelsea's laugh came next, bright and brittle. You really can't handle anything anymore, can you? Heat climbed my neck. My grip on the napkin tightened until my knuckles whitened. Daniel didn't defend me. Aunt Lillian's gaze slid away, no one spoke. For a moment, I thought of answering, telling them that every chair under them, every brick in these walls, every cent in Daniel's landscaping business, all of it was mine, paid for after my husband died, with my savings and the insurance settlement. But I said nothing. Instead, I dabbed at the spill until the red smear was faint. Accidents happen. I murmured, my voice calm, my pulse anything but. Chelsea turned away, already laughing at something one of her friends said. The moment was over for them. For me, it was just beginning. I sat back down, letting their conversations wash over me. They talked about vacations, clients, renovations. Not one word to me. The tulips stayed where I'd placed them, drooping a little the warm room. Inside, I could feel an old resolve stirring, the same one that had carried me through my husband's long illness, through years of single parenting, through the quiet purchase of this very house and the land around it. I hadn't survived all that to be treated like a clumsy servant in my own home. The rest of brunch passed in a blur of silverware clinks and forced laughter. My plate went cold. I wasn't hungry. I was planning. When the dessert plates were being set out, I stood. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood, and the sound was enough to turn a few heads. Before we cut the cake, I said, my tone level but carrying, I'd like everyone back at the table. Chelsea's brows pulled together. Why? I didn't answer. I walked to my purse, resting on the chair behind me, and reached inside. My fingers closed around a thick cream-colored folder. I brought it to the table and set it down. The brass clasp gave a soft, final click as I opened it. There are some things you should all know, I said. It was the first time all morning that every single eye turned to me. Not to order, not to mock, but to listen, and I wasn't going to waste it. That afternoon, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I drove home with the radio off. The hum of the tires was steady, almost hypnotic, letting my thoughts drift backward. My desk sat in the corner of the living room, a sturdy oak piece my husband and I bought decades ago. The late daylight fell across its surface, catching the brass corners of a leather-bound folder. I reached for it without thinking, fingers brushing the familiar worn edge. Inside, the first page was a letter, the one he'd written before his final surgery. His handwriting, bold and a little uneven, still pulled me in. Protect what we built, Margaret. Keep it safe for Daniel and for his children someday. Don't let anyone take it from you. I could hear his voice as if he were in the next room. That steady tone, always a little teasing when he wanted to lighten the mood. The memory was so sharp it almost hurt. I leaned back in the chair, letting the paper rest in my lap. My mind wandered to an Easter long ago, when Daniel was barely 7. We'd lived in the old farmhouse then. Not this polished suburban place Chelsea called hers. The yard was muddy from spring rain, but that didn't stop him from darting across it, clutching a plastic egg as if it were treasure. "You found the golden one?" I'd called from the porch, laughing as he came running. He'd thrown his arms around me, mud and all, and whispered, "Best Easter ever, Mom." Back then, no one could have convinced me that warmth would ever cool. The years had shifted things slowly, almost invisibly. Daniel grew into a man, busy with his business and then with Chelsea. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. And yet I'd kept building, investing, the house, the garden, even buying the company when it faltered, so it would stay in the family. Now those same walls I'd paid for had watched me serve drinks like hired help. The thought sat heavy in my chest. The contrast between then and now was a chasm, and I could feel myself standing at its edge. I set the letter back into the folder, smoothing the pages as if that would calm the restless ache inside me. My hands lingered on the brass clasp before I closed it. This wasn't just a stack of papers. It was the map of my leverage, the quiet key to everything Chelsea thought she controlled, and I wasn't about to forget where I'd put it. I made tea the way I always did on quiet afternoons. Kettle on the old gas stove, cup warming under a stream of hot water. The sound of it filling was a small comfort, a rhythm I could control. While the tea steeped, I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Neatly stacked envelopes, receipts, and a thin blue folder sat there. It held the property deeds, the incorporation papers for Daniel's company, the trust documents naming me sole owner. My name, printed in clean black type, appeared again and again. I remembered the day I signed them, almost 5 years ago. The lawyer's office had smelled faintly of ink and carpet cleaner. My hands had trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of what I was taking on. "This way, no matter what happens, it stays with you," he'd said. I'd nodded, thinking of Daniel's future. Back then, I hadn't imagined needing to use any of it as defense. A car passed outside, its tires crunching over loose gravel. The sound yanked me back to the present. Chelsea's laugh. That bright, practiced tone, replayed in my mind, paired with the red streak of jam on the tablecloth. The heat that had risen in my neck at that moment now curled lower, settling into something more deliberate. I carried my tea to the couch, sinking into the familiar sag of the cushions. The tulips I'd brought to brunch sat on the coffee table, their stems leaning now, petals opening fully. They wouldn't last more than a few days, but in this light, they were still beautiful. I traced one petal with a fingertip, thinking how quickly softness can bruise. Daniel had called once after brunch. A brief check, in that barely touched the surface. "Sorry about earlier," he'd mumbled. Things were tense. I hadn't asked if he meant for me or for himself. Before I could say more, Chelsea's voice floated in the background, and the call ended. I stared at the phone after he hung up. The space between us felt measured now, like there were markers I'd missed along the way. I'd spent years protecting him, building a net under every step he took. And today he'd let me stand alone in a room full of witnesses. I set the cup down and leaned forward, elbows on my knees. The folder was still on the desk, waiting. It wasn't time to use it yet, but the thought of it there, solid, undeniable, steadied me. The next time Chelsea tried to turn me into a prop in her performance, I wouldn't just stand there holding a basket of bread. I would make sure the script ended differently. 2 weeks after Easter, Daniel called and asked if I could stop by the office. Chelsea's reorganizing the front. He said, his tone flat, and she could use an extra pair of hands. I almost said no, but curiosity and something sharper made me agree. The landscaping company's office was a converted brick storefront. I'd paid off the mortgage on it in full the year Daniel took over. As I stepped inside, the smell of fresh paint hit me. Desks had been moved, files stacked on the floor, and Chelsea stood at the reception counter with a clipboard. "Oh, Margaret," she said without looking up. "Perfect timing. The file boxes are heavier than I thought. Can you start moving them to the back?" I set my purse on a chair. "Where's the back room?" She finally looked up, pen tapping against the clipboard. "Through the door behind you. And be careful. You're not 20 anymore." The words landed like a slap. I glanced toward Daniel's office. The door was half closed, but I could see him inside on a call, his hand covering the receiver. He wasn't coming out. I lifted the first box, heavier than it looked, and carried it to the back. Dust coated my palms. The air was cooler there, dim, smelling faintly of paper and oil from the delivery truck that sometimes parked outside. When I returned for the second box, Chelsea had moved closer, blocking my way. "Actually, let's switch. I'll point, you move. It's faster that way." I set the box down, Meeting her eyes. You have other staff for this. Her smile thinned. They're busy with paying clients. For a moment, neither of us moved. The hum of the office printer filled the space between us. My heart thudded once hard, but my voice stayed even. Then perhaps you should ask your husband. She tilted her head, mock sympathy in her tone. Oh, Margaret, Daniel has enough on his plate without worrying about these little things. I could hear the pause before. These little things. The unspoken you. My pulse steadied, not from calm but from decision. I picked up the box, carried it to the back room, and set it down with more force than necessary. The thump echoed off the bare walls. By the time I returned, Chelsea was chatting on her phone, one hand idly flipping through the company's appointment book. She didn't thank me. Didn't acknowledge me at all. I left without telling Daniel goodbye. The late afternoon sun hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, bright and unyielding. In my mind, I could see the folder on my desk at home, waiting. I was starting to think I'd need it sooner than I'd planned. The next Friday, Daniel invited me to lunch at a small cafe downtown. Chelsea might swing by, he said, as if it were an afterthought. I agreed, hoping maybe this time we could talk without tension. The cafe was crowded, sunlight pouring through the big front windows. I spotted Daniel at a corner table, already scrolling through his phone. Chelsea arrived 10 minutes later, wearing sunglasses indoors and carrying a shopping bag. Margaret, she said, sliding into the seat beside him. You're early. I didn't think you'd have much else going on. Her voice was loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over. I kept my smile polite. I try to make time for family. Oh, that's sweet, she said, leaning toward Daniel. It must be nice to have that kind of flexibility when you're not working. Daniel cleared his throat but didn't correct her. My stomach tightened. The waiter came for our orders. Chelsea rattled off hers without looking at the menu, then turned to me. Maybe something light for you. Those portions can be a bit much. Her gaze flicked over me like she was measuring the space I took up. I'll decide for myself, I said evenly. The smile stayed on my face, but my hands gripped the edge of the table beneath it. While we waited for the food, Chelsea pulled out a brochure from her bag. Daniel, about the new contract with the city. She began, flipping it toward him. We'll need updated insurance. I've been talking to a friend in real estate. She says transferring the property titles temporarily could help with liability. Daniel hesitated. That's something we'd have to discuss. She waved a hand. Of course. But if we handle it now, before the busy season, it'll be cleaner. Her eyes slid to me, just long enough to let me know she was aware of exactly whose name was on those titles. I felt the shift in the air, subtle, but there. This wasn't just idle conversation. She was probing, testing the edges of what she could push. Our food arrived, breaking the moment, but my appetite was gone. I listened to Chelsea talk about her shopping trip, her pilot's class, the new curtains for their bedroom. Each word felt like another small claim staked in territory she thought was hers. When lunch ended, Daniel hugged me briefly. Chelsea offered a quick wave, already walking toward the door. I stayed seated until they were gone, letting the cafe noise fill the space they left behind. On the drive home, my thoughts circled the same point. Chelsea was moving faster now, not just with her words but with her plans. And Daniel was letting her. By the time I reached my street, my decision was made. The folder on my desk wasn't just a shield anymore. It was going to be a weapon. It was raining the afternoon Daniel called. His voice was careful, too even. Mom, could you stop by the house? There's some paperwork we need you to sign. Nothing big, just routine. I knew better than to believe. Nothing big. When I arrived, Chelsea was already waiting in the living room, a manila folder in her hands. She gestured toward the sofa. Let's make this quick. I've got an appointment in an hour. Daniel sat beside her, not looking directly at me. It's about the property, he said. Chelsea's been talking with an attorney about streamlining our assets for the business. Chelsea slid the papers across the coffee table. If we temporarily transfer the deed into the company's name, it'll make us eligible for a larger credit line. Totally reversible, of course. Her tone was breezy, but her eyes were locked on mine. She was waiting for a reaction. I picked up the first page. Legal language, dense paragraphs, but the words transfer of ownership stood out in bold. My fingers traced the line where my signature would go. And what happens? I asked slowly. If the company can't pay back this new line of credit. Chelsea's smile didn't falter. That's not going to happen. We've got several contracts lined up. Daniel added quickly, "It's just a formality, Mom. We'd move it back under your name in a few months." I set the paper down, my hands resting lightly on it. "I'll need time to read this?" Chelsea's voice sharpened. "We don't have weeks, Margaret. Opportunities like this don't wait." I met her gaze, keeping my expression neutral. "Then perhaps it isn't the right opportunity." For a moment, no one spoke. The rain outside tapped against the windows, steady and soft. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Chelsea leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said. I almost laughed. Complicated? I'd navigated hospital billing statements, mortgage negotiations, and investment contracts alone after my husband died. Complicated was a language I spoke fluently. Instead, I said, "I'll take the folder home, review it, and get back to you." I stood before either of them could object. Chelsea's eyes narrowed. Daniel rose halfway from his seat, then sat back down. Neither followed me to the door. Outside, the rain had let up, leaving the air damp and heavy. I walked to my car, the folder tucked under my arm. It felt heavier than it should, not from the paper but from the intent behind it. At home, I placed it on my desk next to the cream-colored folder that held my own documents. The contrast between the two was stark. One meant to strip me of control, the other to cement it. I rested my hand on my folder, feeling the cool brass clasp under my palm. Chelsea thought she was closing in. What she didn't know was that every move she made was drawing me closer to my own checkmate. The folder from Chelsea sat unopened on my desk for 2 days. I wasn't ignoring it. I was studying it. Every evening after dinner, I'd read a few more pages, highlighting terms, making notes in the margins. And the more I read, the more one question pressed in: why the rush? On the third day, I decided to log into the bank account tied to the property. It had been months since I'd checked it. The balance appeared on the screen, and my stomach tightened. Several large withdrawals had been made in the last 6 weeks. Not small payments for supplies or utilities. These were clean, round numbers, each in the tens of thousands. One transfer in particular caught my eye. It was dated 3 days after Easter, sent to an account I didn't recognize. The memo field was blank. I clicked into the transaction history. More transfers, more blank memos. The total was enough to pay off a year's worth of business loans, or to sink a company if it failed. My first thought was Daniel. Had he approved this? My second was colder, or had Chelsea done it without telling him? I printed the statements, the paper still warm in my hands. I slid them into the cream-colored folder with my deeds and trust documents. The 2 sets of papers didn't belong together, but for now, they needed to sit side by side. This was evidence. The phone rang. Daniel's number. I let it go to voicemail. Moments later, a text from him. "For Chelsea's wondering if you've had a chance to sign." Not we're wondering. Not I'm wondering. Chelsea's wondering. I typed a short reply. Still reviewing. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I looked around the room. The framed photographs, the shelves of books, the tulips now long gone. All of it felt different when you knew someone was trying to take the ground out from under you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the numbers from the statements, the blank memo lines like open secrets. Around 2 a.m., I got up, turned on the desk lamp, and opened my folder again. I studied the trust clauses, the ownership stipulations, the legal protections my husband and I had agreed upon years ago. They were still solid, still mine. But Chelsea's push to, temporarily, move the property could bypass them, if I wasn't paying attention. By the time the sun came up, my course was clear. I wasn't just going to refuse to sign. I was going to find out exactly where that money had gone and why. Chelsea thought she was playing a fast game. She hadn't realized yet that I could play slow. And in a slow game, patience isn't just a virtue, it's a weapon. The morning after I decided not to sign, the calls stopped. No more, just checking in from Daniel, no group texts about Sunday dinners. Even the gardening club, where Chelsea had volunteered to help manage communication, suddenly stopped sending me updates. It was subtle at first, a missed call here, a forgotten invitation there. But within a week, the pattern was clear. Chelsea was drawing a line, and Daniel was standing on her side of it. On the second Sunday, I drove by their house. The driveway was full. Daniel's truck, Chelsea's SUV, and a couple of cars I didn't recognize. Through the dining room window, I caught a glimpse of people around the table. Plates, wine glasses, laughter. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the scene through the glass. No one looked toward the window. I didn't knock. I just turned the key and drove home. That night, I received a single text from Daniel to Chelsea thought it would be less stressful if we had smaller gatherings for a while. Less stressful for whom? The words stayed on my screen long after I closed the phone. The only person who didn't disappear was Emily, my granddaughter from Daniel's first marriage. She was 22 now, living in a small apartment across town, studying part-time and working evenings. She started stopping by once a week, usually after her shifts, with leftover soup or bakery rolls from the cafe where she worked. One night, over mugs of tea at my kitchen table, she frowned. "Grandma, are you okay? I feel like they're avoiding you." I hesitated. I didn't want to pull her into the middle. "Things are complicated?" Emily leaned forward. "Chelsea's been saying you're tired all the time. That you're better off staying home. But that's not true." Her voice carried both anger and confusion. I recognized the look in her eyes. The same one I'd seen in the mirror when I first realized Chelsea's game. I reached for her hand. Sometimes, people rewrite the story to suit themselves. The trick is not letting them make it the only version anyone hears. She squeezed my hand, her jaw tight. "If you need help, I'm here." After she left that night, I walked through the quiet house. The folder was still on my desk, the bank statements tucked inside. Every day I left it, there was another day Chelsea thought she was winning. But isolation has a way of sharpening the mind. The silence gave me space to think, to notice details I might have missed in the noise of normal life. I started a list: names, dates, transfers, conversations, every piece of the puzzle I'd need when the time came. Chelsea wanted me invisible. She was about to learn that invisible doesn't mean powerless. By the third week, Chelsea's plan was in full swing. I went to the grocery store on Wednesday, as I always did, and ran into Marjorie from the gardening club near the produce section. Normally she'd greet me with a hug and a half-hour of gossip. This time, she smiled politely but glanced around before speaking. "Oh, Margaret, Chelsea mentioned you've been having trouble keeping up lately. I didn't want to bother you?" Bother me, as if seeing a friend was an intrusion. I kept my smile steady. "I'm fine, Marjorie. Always glad to catch up." Her expression faltered, but she didn't linger. She picked up her basket and hurried off, leaving me standing among the apples and pears, the hum of the refrigerators filling the space where conversation used to be. At the pharmacy the next day, the clerk, a young man who'd always chatted about the weather, avoided eye contact. He rang up my prescription quickly, his words clipped. "Chelsea's been picking up for you lately?" he said, almost as an afterthought. That was the moment I realized Chelsea wasn't just keeping me out of events. She was managing my errands, my image, and planting little seeds about my declining health. Emily noticed too. She came over Friday evening with a grocery bag in her arms. "Grandma, I heard Chelsea telling Aunt Sharon that you're not supposed to drive anymore." I set the bag on the counter, the paper crinkling under my hands. "Well, that's news to me." Emily's eyes narrowed. "She's making you sound fragile, like you can't take care of yourself." I poured us both tea, the steam curling between us. Fragile is just another word for easy to push. And I've never been easy to push. We ate in the kitchen, the warm light pooling over the table. Emily told me about her classes, her plans for the summer, the job she wanted after graduation. For a while, the house felt alive again. After she left, I walked through the darkened rooms. Every shadow seemed longer, every corner quieter. Chelsea's voice echoed in my mind, those careful, public little jabs that landed harder because they were wrapped in concern. I sat at my desk, pulling the cream-colored folder closer. I laid out the bank statements, the trust documents, and the list I'd been keeping. Every slight, every withdrawal, every falsehood. The pages formed a web, and at the center sat Chelsea. The silence no longer felt empty. It was a chamber, holding the weight of what I knew and what I would do with it. Chelsea thought she'd left me with nothing. But she'd overlooked the one truth I'd built my life on. When you strip away the noise, you can hear the exact moment the tide turns. The invitation came in a group text from Daniel of Company Open House this Saturday. "Everyone welcome," and I almost deleted it. But the words, "everyone welcome," stayed with me. It wasn't Daniel's style, it was Chelsea's, and if Chelsea wanted me there, it wasn't out of kindness. Saturday afternoon, I drove to the office. The storefront had been dressed up for the occasion, balloons tied to the door handle, a long table covered in brochures and hors d'oeuvres, a speaker playing soft jazz. People milled about, clients, vendors, family, friends. Chelsea spotted me almost instantly. Her smile was wide, too wide, and she raised her voice just enough to carry. "Margaret, you made it. We were worried you'd get lost." A few heads turned. I ignored the comment, walking toward the refreshment table. The air smelled of coffee and something fried. Mini quiches, maybe? Chelsea trailed me like a shadow. She gestured toward the stack of paper plates. "Could you start handing these out? Some of the guests look hungry." I picked up a plate and turned, but before I could move, she added, "Careful, dear. We don't want any accidents. Remember the jam at Easter?" A small ripple of laughter moved through the group nearby. My cheeks burned, but I kept my expression calm. "I'll manage," I said, my voice steady. The afternoon dragged on, each interaction with Chelsea a small cut. She introduced me to people as Daniel's mom, who's mostly retired now, and made a point of helping me carry things I could easily manage myself. Daniel was busy talking contracts, oblivious or pretending to be. Then, just as the crowd was gathering near the display of new landscaping designs, Chelsea called out, "Margaret, could you bring the sample binder over here? It's on the shelf in the back." I walked into the back room, found the binder, and returned, only to hear her voice again, pitched for maximum reach. "Everyone, make way! Margaret's coming through, and we know she's a little unsteady." The words hit like a shove. My grip on the binder tightened. The people nearest stepped aside awkwardly, eyes darting between us. I set the binder on the table without a word. Chelsea laughed lightly. "Oh, I'm just teasing. She knows I mean well." I looked at her, meeting her gaze head-on. "Of course," I said, but there was no smile in my voice. For the rest of the event, I stayed on the edges, watching, listening. Every calculated dig, every half-smile. She wanted me smaller, quieter, until I disappeared completely. But the thing about disappearing is, people stop looking at you, and that gives you room to move without being seen. By the time the last guest left, I had noticed something. A small interaction between Chelsea and a vendor by the front desk. The kind of thing I could use. Not yet, but soon. I walked out into the cool evening air, my hands empty, my mind not. Chelsea thought she'd won the room. She had no idea she'd just given me my next move. Follow my story until the end and tell me, if you were standing in my place, would you have walked away quietly, or would you have made them regret it? I was halfway to my car when I saw the vendor Chelsea had been speaking to earlier. A stocky man in a windbreaker, carrying a box of sample pavers. He stopped me on the sidewalk. "You're Margaret, right? Daniel's mom?" he asked. "That's right," I said. He smiled. "We've been trying to finalize payment for last month's order. Chelsea told me the company's ownership was shifting soon, so to hold the invoice until the new paperwork went through. But you'd probably know more about that." I felt the air change. "Ownership shifting?" I repeated, keeping my tone light. "That's interesting." He frowned slightly. "She didn't mention it to you?" I shook my head. "First I've heard of it." We chatted a few minutes more, just enough for me to confirm that Chelsea had been talking about the property, not just the business. Then I thanked him and walked to my car, my mind already slotting this into the growing puzzle. Inside the car, I sat for a moment, engine off, watching through the glass storefront as Chelsea laughed with two clients. She touched one man's arm lightly, that same performative smile in place. But when her gaze flicked toward the parking lot and caught mine, I saw the smallest pause. The briefest flicker of something that wasn't confidence. I gave her a polite nod before starting the engine. At home, I pulled out my cream-colored folder and added a new page to my notes, a vendor conversation ownership shifting, instructed to delay invoice. I dated it, underlined it twice. The next morning, I sent an email to Daniel copying Chelsea. Short, professional. "Met with one of your vendors last night. He mentioned an upcoming ownership change. Let's set a time to discuss in detail so we can all be on the same page." It was the kind of message that couldn't be ignored without making them look evasive. Within minutes, Chelsea replied, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's talk soon." Good. Let her worry about which part I'd heard and how much I knew. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was Marjorie from the gardening club, the same woman who'd avoided me in the grocery store. "Margaret," she said, her voice warm again. "Chelsea stopped by the meeting yesterday. She mentioned you might be back with us soon." Interesting. That wasn't her script before. It told me something important. Chelsea could shift her narrative when she felt pressure, and I'd just given her a reason to adjust it. The mini twist wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't loud. It was the seed of doubt, planted in her own mind and in the minds of the people she thought she controlled. A reminder that I wasn't as isolated as she believed. That Saturday evening, Emily stopped by with a bag of scones. "I heard you made an impression at the open house," she said, eyes bright. "Did you?" I asked. She nodded. "One of Chelsea's friends told someone you've still got a spark?" I smiled. "Good. Sparks have a way of starting fires." As Emily left, the streetlights flicked on outside, casting a glow across my desk where the folder lay open. The vendor's note sat on top, crisp and clear. Chelsea thought her humiliation had landed, but in truth, she'd just given me the first public thread to pull. And when you start pulling a thread, the whole fabric can come undone. By Monday morning, the vendor's words were still turning over in my mind. Ownership shifting. It wasn't just a casual comment, it was a leak. And leaks come from cracks. I started with the obvious. The property deeds were in my cream-colored folder, along with the trust documents and insurance papers. I'd checked them a dozen times before, but what if Chelsea had made a move somewhere I wasn't looking? Pulling on a pair of reading glasses, I logged into the county records website. It was tedious work, searching by parcel number, cross-referencing with the trust name. For the first half hour, everything matched. Then I noticed a second listing tied to the company's business address. It was a filing made 3 weeks ago. The description was vague. Preliminary transfer documentation, no signatures yet, but the form was active. And it bore a name I recognized, the attorney Chelsea had mentioned at Easter. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the computer fan filling the room. Preliminary or not, it meant Chelsea was moving pieces without my consent. Quietly. Just enough so that by the time I caught on, she'd be ready to close the trap. Emily called that afternoon. "Want me to bring dinner?" she asked. "Not tonight?" I told her. "I'm working on something." After we hung up, I pulled a small metal box from the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside were files my husband and I had kept locked away, letters from the bank, old loan agreements, the original purchase contracts for the house and land. I compared them against the online records. That's when I noticed a difference in the legal description of the property. Just a few words, but they shifted the boundary line enough to include the strip of land behind the house. The same land Daniel's company had been using for storage. A detail like that could be exploited if you were ruthless enough. And Chelsea was nothing if not ruthless. I printed everything. The county record, the altered description, the original deed. Side by side, the change was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. To someone who didn't, it would seem harmless, routine. The kind of thing you'd sign off on without a second thought. As I slid the papers into the folder, I heard the crunch of tires outside. I peeked through the blinds. Daniel's truck, Chelsea's SUV right behind it. They didn't call first. That alone told me this wasn't a social visit. A knock sounded at the door, not the light, polite, kind, firm. Rhythmic. I took my time answering. Chelsea was on the porch, Daniel just behind her. She didn't waste a second. "Margaret, we really need to finalize that paperwork," she said. "It's holding up some important projects." Daniel shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "I've been reviewing it," I replied, "and I have some questions." Her smile tightened. "Questions can be handled later. The opportunity window is closing." I stepped aside, letting them in. "Then you'd better hope the answers come quickly." As they walked into the living room, my mind was already racing. This was no longer about stalling. It was about catching them in a lie they couldn't explain away. And I had the first thread in my hand. Chelsea perched on the edge of the sofa, her designer bag placed carefully at her feet. Daniel stood near the mantel, arms crossed. It was the same formation they used at Easter. Chelsea front and center, Daniel as silent reinforcement. I set the cream-colored folder on the coffee table but didn't open it. "Before I sign anything," I began, "I want to understand why the legal description of the property was changed." Chelsea blinked. "Changed? I'm not sure what you mean." I slid the printed pages across the table. The original deed and the new preliminary transfer filing. The boundary line change was highlighted in yellow. Her eyes flicked over the papers and she gave a little laugh. "That's just standard legal housekeeping. The attorney said it's cleaner this way." "Cleaner," I repeated. Interesting choice of word. Daniel shifted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Mom, it's not a big deal. It just streamlines the business footprint. Streamlines it right into Chelsea's control," I said evenly. "That strip of land is worth more than some of your landscaping contracts. Chelsea's smile was quick and tight. "You've been doing your homework." "I've been protecting what's mine," I replied. For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking in the hall. Chelsea broke the silence. "Margaret, no one's trying to take anything from you. This is about efficiency." I leaned forward. "Then you won't mind explaining why a vendor was told to hold an invoice until an ownership shift goes through?" Daniel's head snapped toward Chelsea. "What vendor?" She smoothed her skirt. "Probably a misunderstanding. You know how people talk." "No," I said softly. "I know how people plan." Her jaw tightened. But she didn't answer. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then I stacked the papers neatly and placed them back in the folder. "I'll review the rest of this with my attorney," I said. "Until then, nothing moves." Chelsea stood, her movements controlled but stiff. "Fine, but don't let this drag on too long. Opportunities don't wait forever." I walked them to the door. Daniel hesitated on the porch, his voice low. "Mom, maybe you should just trust us?" I met his eyes. "Trust is earned, Daniel. And right now, you're letting someone spend it faster than it can be replaced." He didn't answer. They walked to the SUV, Chelsea's heels clicking on the walkway. I stayed in the doorway until they drove off. Back inside, I opened the folder again and added 2 new notes. Chelsea deflected boundary change question. No direct answer. And, for Daniel unaware of vendor conversation, possible leverage. As I wrote, I realized something: Chelsea wasn't expecting me to confront her with specifics. She'd counted on vague resistance, easy to steamroll. But now she knew I had details, and that meant she'd start covering her tracks. Which also meant she might make mistakes in the rush. I closed the folder and set it beside the desk lamp. The light pooled over the cream cover, casting a sharp shadow across the table. Chelsea had tightened the net. But she'd also stepped into it with me. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed, the ceiling a pale blur above me, the shadows from the windows shifting as the streetlights swayed in the wind. Every time I closed my eyes, Chelsea's voice returned, smooth, clipped, hiding the edge beneath sugar. I turned onto my side and stared at the dresser. On top sat a small wooden box, worn smooth from years of handling. My husband, Peter, had carved it himself during our first winter in Vermont. Inside were mementos: a watch he'd worn every day, ticket stubs from a trip to Boston, and a folded note in his handwriting. I reached for the box, the hinges creaking softly. The note was exactly where I'd left it. The paper had yellowed, but his words were still clear. "Never let anyone else write the ending for you." I read it twice, then pressed it flat against my palm. Peter had been gone for 12 years, but in moments like this, I could still hear his voice, steady, certain, always reminding me that control was something you claimed, not something you waited to be handed. In the kitchen, I made tea and sat at the table, the steam curling up into the quiet air. The house felt different at night, not empty, but expectant, as if it was waiting for me to decide what came next. On the counter, the cream-colored folder sat where I'd left it. I opened it and began sorting the contents into piles: deeds, trust papers, bank statements, notes from conversations. I sharpened a pencil and started a fresh page of Step 1: Secure independent legal review, Step 20: Document every change in property description or asset transfer, as Step 3: Identify allies who can confirm details without tipping Chelsea off. The pencil moved faster as I wrote. Names came to mind: the vendor, Marjorie from the gardening club, even the clerk at the pharmacy who'd mentioned Chelsea picking up my prescriptions. People who might talk if they thought they were just sharing harmless information. By the time the list reached the bottom of the page, the tea had gone cold. I set the pencil down and flexed my fingers. It wasn't just about stopping her anymore. It was about making sure she couldn't try again. I went to the front window and looked out over the yard. The strip of land Chelsea had tried to fold into her plans stretched out under the moonlight, the grass silver in the glow. Peter had planted the first maple tree there. I remembered him standing in that exact spot, telling me it would outlive both of us. It would, if I protected it. The clock in the hall struck 2. I returned to the kitchen, tucked the new list into the folder, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Then I locked it, not because I thought Chelsea would break in, but because rituals have power, and locking that drawer felt like sealing a promise. Upstairs, I climbed back into bed, the note from Peter still on my nightstand. My eyes stayed open, but the restlessness had shifted. It wasn't the churn of helplessness anymore. It was the hum of something forming. By morning, my plan had edges. I started small, A call to the county clerk's office. My voice was polite, curious, the kind of tone that didn't raise alarms. I asked about the preliminary transfer filing and whether any follow-up documents had been submitted. The clerk confirmed there'd been no final signatures yet. Would you like me to flag the file for updates? She asked.
Yes,
I said. And if possible, notify me directly. Next, I stopped by the pharmacy. The same clerk was behind the counter. I paid for a small item, then leaned in slightly. I heard Chelsea's been picking up my prescriptions. Was there a reason she said I couldn't? He frowned. She mentioned you'd asked her to for convenience. I smiled faintly. Interesting. I'll take care of them myself from now on. He hesitated, then added, she's been asking about your next refill dates, too. That was another note for the folder. By midday, I was at the gardening club. I hadn't been in weeks, and the room went quiet for a moment when I walked in. Marjorie crossed the floor to greet me. Glad you came? She said. Chelsea told us you might be stepping back permanently. Funny. I replied, I hadn't decided that yet. I spent the meeting listening more than talking. Snippets of conversation floated my way. Chelsea had visited last week, mentioning future changes in my living situation. She'd planted the idea carefully, the way you'd lay down mulch before a new season. When I got home, I typed up every conversation, every hint, into a timeline. The pattern was emerging. Chelsea was controlling the narrative before making her move. If I wanted to stop her, I had to disrupt that narrative. That evening, I made my first deliberate test. I called Daniel's office and left a message with his assistant. Tell him I'll be attending the vendor appreciation dinner next month, I said clearly. I've already confirmed with the organizer. It wasn't true, not yet. But I knew the message would reach Chelsea before it reached him. I wanted to see if she'd try to block me publicly or privately. 2 days later, my phone buzzed. A text from Chelsea. Margaret. That dinner might not be the best fit for you this year. I'll fill you in later. I smiled. She'd taken the bait. Her need to control access was reflexive and every reflex could be used. That night, I laid out my notes and highlighted the key pressure points. 1. The property transfer delay. 2. The vendor conversation. 3. The false fragility narrative. 4. The blocked event invitation. Each was a thread I could pull, but timing mattered. Too soon, and she'd tighten her guard. Too late, and she might succeed in slipping the papers through. I locked the folder away and turned off the light. The house settled into quiet, but my mind didn't. Somewhere between thought and sleep, I realized the truth. Chelsea thought she was building a case against me. In reality, I was building a case around her. And soon the walls would start closing in. Not on me. Quiet moves work best when no one is watching. By the next morning, I was at my lawyer's office. I hadn't seen Martin in years, but he still remembered Peter and the purchase of our property. We sat in his book-lined conference room, the blinds drawn. I need 2 things, I told him. A full legal audit of my assets and a freeze on any transfer until I approve it in writing. Martin's eyebrows rose. That'll ruffle feathers. Good, I said. I want them ruffled quietly. We went through the folder piece by piece. When I handed him the county records showing the altered boundary line, his jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident, he said. Someone's preparing to shift leverage. I left with signed orders and a promise. Any attempt to finalize a transfer would trigger a legal hold and a direct call to me. From there, I drove to the bank. The branch manager, Sylvia, had known me for decades. I asked to review all joint accounts with Daniel's company listed as a beneficiary. There were 3 I'd nearly forgotten. All set up when Peter was alive. For business continuity, I signed paperwork to remove any non-essential access. No notices to the other parties. I told Sylvia. Process it quietly. Back home, I began another layer of the plan, reclaiming the narrative Chelsea had been spreading. I called Marjorie, asking if she'd help me organize a small charity event in my garden next month. Nothing extravagant, just tea, scones, and a tour of the tulips. Within hours, the invitations went out. They made one thing clear: I was still active, still hosting, still in control of my space. It was a subtle public counterpoint to Chelsea's fragility story. That evening, I stopped by the vendor's warehouse under the pretense of ordering new pavers for a walkway. As we talked about sizes and colors, I asked casually if Chelsea had followed up about the delayed invoice. He shook his head. Haven't heard a thing. Perfect. I left with a receipt and a handshake, and one more note for the file. By midweek, small ripples had already begun. Marjorie called to say Chelsea had asked about the garden event, sounding a little surprised. Sylvia left me a discreet voicemail confirming the account changes. Martin emailed to say the county clerk had flagged an inquiry from Chelsea's attorney about the status of transfer documents. Every move was invisible to them until it landed. That was the point. Friday afternoon, I saw Daniel's truck slow as it passed my house. He didn't stop, just looked once toward the porch where I was watering the plants. There was a question in that look, maybe even doubt. I kept my expression neutral, lifting a hand in a small wave. Inside, I added the week's notes to the growing timeline. It was no longer just a defense plan. It was a map leading straight to the moment I'd take back everything, in one stroke. Chelsea thought I was cornered. She hadn't realized I'd been drawing the lines myself. If you were me, would you keep playing the quiet game until the very last moment, or would you drop the truth on them now and watch the fallout begin? The next step had to sting, just enough to draw blood without showing the blade. I chose the landscaping supply contract. It was one of Daniel's steady income streams, funneled quietly through my property's maintenance budget. Peter had set it up years ago so the company would always have work during slow seasons. Chelsea, of course, had taken over managing it. I called Martin first. If I cancel a service contract attached to my personal property, can they contest it? Not unless the contract itself limits your right to terminate, he said. Send me the paperwork before you act. I did, and within an hour, he replied, You're clear. Give the required notice and keep a copy. The notice went out that afternoon by certified mail. It was polite, succinct, and final services ending in 30 days, all future work to be bid competitively. I didn't copy Daniel or Chelsea directly. I wanted the letter to land in their hands through official channels, not from me. 2 days later, the phone rang. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, his voice was tight. Mom, I just heard about the maintenance contract. We need to talk. This affects more than you realize. Chelsea's voice followed faintly in the background. Not words, just the sharp tone of someone giving instructions. I didn't call back. Instead, I drove to the local nursery and placed a large order for seasonal flowers and mulch. Paid in full, delivery to my property in 2 weeks. A subtle message. Work was still being done here, just not through them. By Thursday, the ripples were visible. Marjorie called, laughing softly. Saw Chelsea at the market. She was telling someone you've been making unwise decisions lately. Her jaw nearly hit the floor when I told her your garden event had twice as many RSVPs as hers. I made a note in my folder, public narrative shifting. Late that afternoon, I received a letter from the county clerk's office. Inside was a formal notice the preliminary transfer filing for my property had been withdrawn. I read it twice, feeling the quiet rush of victory. They hadn't even tried to push it through. Pulling the filing meant they were recalculating, maybe even retreating. But I didn't relax. Retreat could be temporary. Chelsea was too proud to leave the game entirely. She'd be looking for another opening. That night, I stood at the window, the porch light casting a circle on the driveway. In the distance, a pair of headlights slowed. Chelsea's SUV. She didn't pull in, just idled for a moment before driving on. Watching me, testing the waters, I couldn't be sure. I turned away, locking the front door. The folder sat on my desk, thicker now, its contents neatly tabbed. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a playbook. The next move would be mine, and it wouldn't be quiet. If you were holding all the threads, would you wait for the perfect moment, or pull hard now and watch everything unravel in front of them? The clock started ticking at 7:00 a.m. I stood at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside me, my list for the day spread open. At the top, in bold penciled cut access, all of it, I'd spent weeks gathering threads. Today I would pull every single one. The first call was to Martin. We're moving forward, I told him. Every restriction we discussed. Today. He didn't ask why. I'll have my paralegal start the filings by 9. Next, I called Sylvia at the bank. Initiate the final step on the accounts, I said. Remove any and all authorized signers except me? There was a pause. That includes Daniel? Yes, I said, especially Daniel. By mid-morning, I was at the utilities office downtown. I had all the accounts. Water, electric, internet. Switched to new passwords and security questions. No more family member verifications. From now on, only my voice, my ID. From there, I drove to the county clerk's office. I asked for certified copies of every document tied to my property, including the withdrawn transfer filing. The clerk slid the papers into a thick envelope.
Want me to seal it? Please?
I said. And I'll take 2 more copies. Outside, the air was brisk, the kind that wakes you up from the inside. I could feel my pulse steady, each step deliberate. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precision. Just after noon, I visited the vendor whose words had first tipped me off. He looked surprised to see me. Didn't expect you here in person. I wanted to thank you, I said, for being honest. We chatted briefly and I settled the outstanding invoice in cash. No trail Chelsea could intercept, no leverage she could twist. Back home, I locked the documents in the fireproof safe under my desk. Then I placed the cream-colored folder on top. No longer a loose collection of notes, but a complete record. Every conversation, every copy, every receipt. At 3:00 p.m. Martin called back, account secured, property holds in place. You're now the sole signatory on everything. I wrote 1 word at the bottom of my list of don't. Almost. Because the final step would be face-to-face. They needed to know the rules had changed and they'd hear it from me. I stood at the window, watching the long stretch of road leading to my house. Somewhere down that road, Chelsea and Daniel were still moving pieces on their mental chessboard. They didn't realize the board itself had been replaced. I didn't call ahead. By late afternoon, I was standing on the porch of Daniel's office. Through the glass door, I saw Chelsea at the reception desk, her phone in hand, her tone clipped and animated. She froze when she saw me, then plastered on a brittle smile. Margaret, what a surprise! I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. I'm here to save you the trouble of making up another story. Her eyes flickered. I'm not sure what you mean. Daniel emerged from the back, wiping his hands. Mom, this isn't a good. It's the perfect time. I cut in. I thought you should both hear this from me. I set the cream-colored folder on the counter between us. The sound it made. A soft thud was louder than it should have been in the quiet room. These are certified copies of every document tied to the house, the land, and the accounts, I said. As of this morning, I am the sole signatory on all assets. No transfers, no shared authority, no access for either of you. Daniel's face tightened. Chelsea's lips parted, but no words came. I've also locked all utility accounts and vendor contracts, I continued. From now on, any work done on my property will be approved and paid by me alone. Chelsea found her voice. That's overreacting. We were just trying to make things more efficient. I held her gaze, changing property boundaries without telling me, asking vendors to delay invoices. That's not efficiency. That's theft in slow motion. Daniel's jaw shifted. Mom, you're reading too much into. I opened the folder and slid out a single sheet. The county clerk stamped notice of the withdrawn transfer filing. If I were reading too much into it, you wouldn't have pulled this the moment you realized I'd flagged it. Chelsea glanced at Daniel, then back at me. You can't just cut us out.
I can, I said evenly.
And I have. The air between us felt weighted, as if the whole room leaned toward that folder. Daniel's eyes dropped to it, then to me. So what now? That depends on you, I said. You can keep playing or you can stop. But if you try again, I'll do more than just block you. I'll make it public. I closed the folder, tucking it under my arm. Consider this your only warning. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out. The late sun was low over the parking lot, throwing my shadow long ahead of me. Behind me, the door stayed shut. No calls, no shouts, just the muffled weight of silence. The next move would be the last. The final piece was already in motion. That evening, I hosted a vendor appreciation dinner at the local inn. Nothing lavish, just 30 people who had worked with my property for years. Marjorie was there, the nursery owner, the paver supplier, even the electrician who'd rewired the porch. I'd sent the invitations myself, hand-delivered. Chelsea and Daniel had no idea it was happening until they walked in by accident. The look on Chelsea's face when she saw me at the head of the long table was almost worth the weeks of planning. She recovered quickly, that tight smile snapping into place. Margaret, I didn't know? Of course you didn't. I said, my voice carrying over the quiet conversations. This is for people who've earned my trust. The room stilled. Daniel's eyes flicked around, recognizing faces, realizing they were all looking at me, not him. I stood, glass in hand. I want to thank each of you for your honesty and your work. From this day forward, all contracts and payments will come directly from me. No intermediaries, no approval channels. A murmur swept the table. For the vendors, it was clarity and security. For Chelsea, it was the public severing of her influence. Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, can we talk privately?" "This is the talk?" I said. "Everyone here knows there's been confusion. That ends tonight." I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim stack of fresh contracts, each bearing my signature alone. "If you want to keep working with me, sign these before you leave. Payment schedules remain the same, no delays, no substitutions." A chair scraped as people leaned forward, pens scratched. Chelsea stood frozen, her hands tightening on the back of a chair. When the last signature was on paper, I gathered the contracts and slid them into the folder. "Thank you," I said to the room, then turned to Chelsea and Daniel. "You've been replaced? By competence?" The blow landed without me raising my voice. They both knew this wasn't just about contracts. It was about control, and I'd taken it all back in a single evening. I left before they could answer. Outside, the air was cool and clean, the kind that clears the last fog from your mind. I walked to my car, the folder under my arm, my steps steady. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror. Chelsea standing under the inn's lantern light, Daniel beside her, both looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. The one-day cutoff was complete. Whatever they tried next, it would be on my terms. The morning after the dinner was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in months. No calls, no texts, no surprise knocks at the door. The only sound was the kettle whistling in the kitchen and the low hum of the refrigerator. It felt light, like someone had opened a window in a stale room. I took my tea out to the porch. The tulips had opened wide overnight, their petals catching the pale morning sun. For once, I didn't think about who might be watching from the street. By mid-morning, I checked my email. Martin had sent a brief note of all changes finalized. Legal holds remain active. No new filings detected. Beneath that, Sylvia's message of account secure. No activity since the cutoff. It was confirmation that the wall I'd built was holding. Around noon, Daniel's truck slowed in front of my house. He didn't stop, just lingered at the corner before driving on. There was no Chelsea beside him. That was new. I spent the afternoon doing things I'd neglected. Organizing the pantry, polishing the silver tray Peter's mother had given us, flipping through an old photo album. The pictures were sun-faded, the edges curled, but I lingered on one Daniel at 12, holding up a lopsided birdhouse we'd built together. He'd been so proud then. I wondered if he remembered. The phone rang just after 3. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened, it was Chelsea's voice, carefully measured. "Margaret, I think we've all said things we regret. Maybe we could find a way to work together again." I didn't delete it. I didn't return it either. Instead, I went to the garden and started clearing a patch near the back fence. The soil was rich, dark under the spade. I worked until the sun dipped low, the air cooling on my skin. There was something grounding in the rhythm. Dig, turn, smooth. It reminded me I could still make things grow on my own. As twilight settled, I sat on the porch steps, a blanket around my shoulders. The street was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence again. I thought about the dinner, about the look on Chelsea's face when the last contract was signed. About Daniel's hesitation, his eyes darting between us as if weighing which side still held value. It wasn't triumph I felt now, but a calm certainty I had done what needed to be done. The game was over. I just wasn't sure if they knew it yet. 2 days later, I woke with a decision fully formed in my mind. By the end of the month, I would be gone. Not running, simply moving forward. There was a difference. I'd already spoken to a realtor in a nearby town about a small lake cottage I'd seen listed. White clapboard siding, a screened porch, and a stretch of water so still it looked painted. The moment I saw the pictures, I knew. The morning air was crisp as I walked through each room of my house, noting what would stay and what would come with me. The heavy oak dining table, staying. The worn leather chair where Peter used to read, coming. The silver tray, definitely coming. I called Martin to arrange the trust transfer for the property. "It'll remain in your name," he explained, "but managed through the trust. That way, even if Daniel tries again, he hits a legal wall." Perfect. In the afternoon, I drove to the lake cottage with Marjorie. We stood on the porch, looking out at the water.
"It's quiet,"
she said. "That's the point," I replied. We walked through the rooms, nothing fancy, just light and space. I imagined mornings with tea on the porch, afternoons with a book, evenings watching the sky turn gold over the water. It felt like breathing without effort. Back home, I began the slow process of packing. 1 box for essentials, 1 for keepsakes, one for donations. Each item I placed inside felt like a choice. What to carry forward, what to leave behind. By the week's end, the calls from Chelsea had stopped. Daniel sent one short text, "I hope you're okay." I read it twice, unsure if it was concern or just curiosity. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on my timeline, utilities scheduled to transfer, garden event to host before I left, a quiet farewell without calling it that, contracts with vendors adjusted for the new trust structure. One evening, as I watered the tulips, a car slowed in front of the house. Chelsea SUV, she didn't stop. Just drove by, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. I wondered if she realized the truth, that I was already stepping beyond her reach. Inside, I stacked the final box by the door. The folder, that thick, cream-colored folder that had been my shield, sat on top. I didn't need it anymore, but I'd take it with me. Not out of fear. Out of memory. This house had been a battlefield. The lake cottage would be a home. The first morning in the lake cottage felt like waking inside a painting. The sun poured through the screened porch, turning the water into molten gold. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, untouched by exhaust or concrete. For the first time in years, I wasn't listening for footsteps or watching the road. I brewed tea in a small blue kettle and carried it outside. The dock creaked under my feet as I walked to the edge, steam curling from my cup. Across the lake, mist hovered like a veil. The trees reflected so perfectly they looked doubled. There was no rush here, no calls to answer, no locks to change, no plans to guard, just space. By mid-morning, I'd unpacked half my books onto a low shelf in the living room. Most were well-worn, gardening guides, old novels, a few history volumes Peter had loved. I left the middle section empty. That space was for something new. The idea had come to me on the drive here, a small community library. Nothing formal, just a corner where neighbors could borrow, swap, or sit with a cup of tea and a good story. A place where no one was excluded, where no one had to prove their worth to belong. After lunch, I walked into town to meet the woman who ran the local cafe. Her name was Leela, and she'd lived here her whole life. When I told her about the library idea, she smiled. People will love that, especially in the winter. We talked about possible events, a monthly book circle, maybe a baking afternoon for the kids. I could see it already. The porch filled with voices, the shelves lined with dog-eared paperbacks, the kettle always warm. Back at the cottage, I sat at the desk by the window and began drafting a simple flyer. The Lake Porch Library, opening next month. I printed a few copies and tucked them into my bag for the cafe bulletin board. As evening fell, I lit a single lamp and opened the back door. The air was cool, the sky streaked with orange and violet. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, the sound low and echoing. I thought of Daniel, of Chelsea, of the house I'd left behind. Not with bitterness, with distance. They were part of the story that brought me here, but they didn't get to write the ending. That was mine. The day of the library opening arrived with a sky so clear it felt like a promise. Leela helped me set out the folding chairs on the porch. We stacked the books. Mysteries, gardening guides, family cookbooks, in neat rows along the wall. A pot of chamomile tea steamed beside a plate of lemon cookies. It wasn't grand, but it was open. That mattered more. The first neighbor to arrive was an older man with a weathered baseball cap. He brought 2 novels and left with one. "Haven't been to a library in years," he said. "Feels good." Then came a young mother with her son, his small hands gripping a comic book like treasure. Others followed. Couples, retirees, a few teenagers curious enough to linger. The porch filled with voices, chairs scraping on wood, pages turning. I moved among them, refilling cups, sharing titles, listening. There was no edge in the air, no careful watching for the wrong word or gesture. Just people choosing to be here. Late in the afternoon, Marjorie appeared holding a framed photo. It was Peter, standing on our old porch, laughing at something out of frame. "Thought you might want this here," she said. I placed it on the shelf above the teapot. The smile in that photo felt like it belonged in this place. As the last guests left, the sun dipped low, painting the lake in gold and rose. I stood on the dock, the wood warm under my bare feet. The air smelled of tea and pine, the sounds of the day still humming in my chest. I thought of how far I'd come. From the moment Chelsea's voice cut me down at Easter brunch to standing here, surrounded by something I'd built entirely on my own terms. There had been anger, yes, but the ending wasn't about crushing anyone. It was about reclaiming what they thought they could take: dignity, autonomy, the right to write my own story. I glanced back at the porch. The shelves stood full, the lamp inside casting a soft glow. Tomorrow, more books would come, more people would visit, and this quiet little library would grow. It would be my legacy, not in wealth or property, but in a place where no one would ever feel unwelcome. The loon called again across the water, its voice carrying into the night. I smiled. Some endings aren't loud. They're steady, certain, and they last.